Professor Sudarshan for drawing out at least some of the themes that we touched upon yesterday when Professor MP Singh was answering a question, and that we are situated far away from Delhi, and how do we keep on engaging with legal institutions or with organizations that work on the field. And Professor MP Singh also pointed in a similar direction, that it is possible to find out various creative ways in which we can keep on engaging with the society despite being in an academy which seems to be in the model that you pointed out as Oxford was, almost in a bubble. But it was interesting to hear from you that it was in Oxford that you found that there was more engagement despite your first initial reaction to that. It was the town and the gown, there are two different parts to it, but the academics were engaging with policy much more there. Something for us to think about. I now invite Professor Rehan Abhay-Rakhne to come and share his experiences and reflections on research and writing.
Okay, good morning. Before I start, it occurred to me sitting there, I sort of had my life flash before my eyes, and I feel like I started at Jindal yesterday, and then I realized that yesterday was 5 years ago, and then I got slightly depressed, but then I also felt happy. And one of the reasons I'm happy is that every year I feel like we always want to have a good faculty development workshop before we start. And most years it isn't pulled off this well. So thank you, Rhythm. It's really nice to have this. It's nice to have the breakout sessions, and it's nice to have so many of you here. The topic today is the relevance and impact of research. So what I'd like to do is raise some questions that I think all of us, or at least maybe most of us, will encounter in our research and writing experiences. And what I'd like to do with these questions in my brief time today is just share my views. I'd like to share them just through personal anecdotes. I think that might be more useful and more concrete. And just a caveat, I think research is quite subjective. I think both the methods you use and the topics you choose to study are very much your own. So even if my specific examples maybe don't speak to you directly, I hope they'll at least provide some food for thought. And then I also hope that they will stimulate discussion in the breakout sessions this afternoon. So what are these questions? These are the three I've come up with. So number one, how does one balance quality and quantity in their publications? I think this is a really important question that at least I struggle with all the time. Number two, how does one make socially meaningful and relevant contributions? I think this picks off a little bit from what Dean Sudarshan was saying earlier. And number three, what does it mean to have quote unquote impactful publications, right? What is impact? And then how does one actually go about writing things that have impact? Okay, so let me start with the first question, which is how do you balance quality and quantity? For me, I think the most difficult part of academic writing is actually the first part, which is coming up with a good idea, right? And by a good idea, I mean one that is novel, one that is interesting, and one that is not totally obvious, right? Something that someone will actually want to publish. And I like to think of these ideas in sort of economics terms, so I think of them as a finite resource, right? They're scarce. When I have one, I want to maximize it. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is I think each idea that you have can actually lead to multiple outcomes and multiple outputs. I don't think an idea is limited to a law review article or a book or something. I think you can do multiple things. So just to share a personal experience, so a couple of years ago I had the idea of applying some of John Rawls's political theory to economic and social rights under the Indian Constitution. And I originally just intended to write a standard law review article about this. And you go about it the sort of usual way. You go about a law review article, you read a bunch of stuff, you make sure you're not saying what anyone else has said, you try to make as coherent an argument as you can, and then you start writing. But while I was writing it, I got an invitation to write a 750-word blog post about this. And I was like, that's a 750-word blog post, that doesn't seem like very much work, and plus that'll reach an audience that a law review article perhaps won't reach, right? Remember that that law review articles often are in databases for which you need paid access or paid subscription. Blogs, of course, are just on the internet. So I set about trying to write this blog post, and I realized that it was actually very, very difficult. Even though I was sort of almost done with a 20,000-word article, condensing that into 750 words was challenging. and it actually took me much longer and was much more difficult than I thought it would be. But at the end of the day, I think it was actually really useful, right? Not only now do I have a second publication of sorts in the form of a blog post, but more than that, it actually made me hone my argument and sort of express it in much more concise and clear terms, which I then found really helped my law review article, right? I can now rewrite and edit my law review article in a much more sort of precise way because I'd written this blog post. And so my point here is just that I think we're sort of moving to a different stage in academic publishing. I think sort of blogs and online journals are the future, and I think they're going to do a lot of the work that print journals did in the past. So I strongly encourage people to take advantage of that. I mean, it's something that I definitely try to do, and I think it can also work the other way. So my example was about how a blog post made my law review article better. But I think the opposite can also be true. That is to say, it's sometimes daunting to think, oh God, I have to write 10,000 words, I have to write 20,000 words. You can start with the blog post, right? If you can get an idea out in 750 words, it could lead to something more. So I think there's that benefit as well, right? It's a start that can lead to something more substantial down the line. Okay, so that's question one on sort of quality and quantity. I guess my takeaway is I think you can have both, but I think to have both, you have to sort of take advantage of different mediums. And again, I think it's all about maximizing a limited number of good ideas. So let me move now to the second anecdote, and this is about sort of how to make socially relevant contributions. So again, a couple of years ago, or maybe it was last year, I'm forgetting now, I have a friend in Sri Lanka who works at the Center for Policy Alternatives, which is a NGO that I guess, I don't know how they would describe themselves, but I think of them as sort of a civil society organization that seeks to hold the government accountable for various human rights organizations. And they were publishing a volume, just an edited volume, commemorating the 35-year anniversary of Sri Lanka's current constitution. And so my friend wanted me to write a chapter for this, comparing executive power in India and Sri Lanka. So I thought about this. I was like, well, on the one hand, you know, it's not a law review article, it's not prestigious, okay? But on the other hand, this organization does a lot of good work. The readership is more narrow in a certain sense, in that it's mostly limited to people in Sri Lanka, but on the other hand, people in civil society will actually read it. It won't be limited to a legal audience. And so, you know, I had to sort of decide sort of how to spend my time. But again, I think you can have your cake and eat it too. So what I did with this article was I asked the editor, I was like, look, if I write this for you, what's the copyright status? Like, you guys take it and that's it? And he's like, no, actually, we don't care at all. Like, you know, we're a public interest organization. We just want to publish this volume. We're not going to get any profit from it. You're welcome to do with the piece whatever you choose. And so I have the freedom now, having spent the time writing this chapter and publishing it with a public interest organization, I have the freedom now to turn it into a law review article, should I so choose. And so again, I think you can make the socially relevant contribution, or what I hope is a socially relevant contribution, without necessarily compromising on other goals you might have, such as publishing in journals and, you know, doing all of that. Okay, and so let me just quickly move to a third example, or a third story. And this goes to impact, right? I think this is a really difficult question, and I don't really know the answer to any of these questions, but I really don't know the answer to this question. I don't really know what we mean by impact in academic research. I think the standard conception, I think you all know, right, is that impact is measurable, right? You look at a statistical database, maybe something like the Washington and Lee Law Journal rankings, and you say, well, if a journal scores high on impact factor, that means it has impact. And in a certain sense, that is true, right? That means that those journals are cited more often. But I think for obvious reasons, this is a little myopic, right? First of all, I think, and most obviously, you might just want a different sort of impact, right? Sort of as in my previous example, you might not want to reach a law review audience. You might not even be writing a law journal. So that's, I think, clear. But I think it's myopic for a couple of other reasons. I think it's not clear that whether or not a particular piece will have impact or not. I'm not sure, I can't give you a sort of personal example about this, but I've heard from senior or more senior scholars, including Raj, people like Vic Kunwar, that things that they wrote 10 or 15 years ago that were then obscure or random have now become sort of seminal pieces in the field, right? But you wouldn't know that necessarily based on what journal they were published in. And you wouldn't necessarily be able to predict it based on the subject matter of the piece. Some of this stuff is just random, and certain subjects become more topical and trendy over the course of time, and certain subjects do not. And the final reason I think that we need to move a little bit beyond statistical rankings is that, and this I really do believe strongly, is that your best work might not be published by the best journal. And this is definitely true for me. And why is this? I think it's because journals care about a lot of things other than the quality of the writing, right? They care about timeliness, they care about trendiness, they care about, whatever their biases and preferences are, right? If it's a peer-reviewed journal, you're not only dealing with the biases of the editors, you're dealing with the biases of the peer reviewers. So I think there are a lot of other factors that go into it. So again, just a quick personal experience. Last year when the Naz Foundation decision came out in the Supreme Court, a friend and I decided to write a short piece looking at it in comparative perspective, and eventually got published in a pretty prestigious journal. By far the best journal of anything that I've published. But I can tell you for sure that this was not my best work. It was published in a fancy journal because the Naz case was making international headlines, and because same-sex marriage and same-sex rights is a very trendy topic in the United States. This was an American journal. And also, as I'm sure most of you know, most American law journals are student-edited, and students are particularly susceptible to things like trendiness and topicality. So I think as I said, even though it was published in a better journal than some of my other work, I don't think it was my best work. And I also, down the line, I'm not sure it'll be my most impactful work, because at the end of the day, it's just about one case, right? It's a case that could be overruled, it's a case that could be superseded, and then why would anyone read the article, right? So I'll just finish by saying I think sort of the key is just to sort of research what you want to research. I think if you put the time and effort into it, I think that's more important, because you can't really predict what's going to be published, I don't think. I don't think you can predict where it's going to be published. And I don't think you can really predict exactly what the impact will be. It's definitely worth shooting for the more prestigious journals, but I hope I've at least given food for thought to the idea that there's more to it than that. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you, Rehan, for raising these three very important questions. And I think the question of balancing quality and quantity has been magnified, mostly in the public universities in India, and it's become a real social issue. And I remember one of my own colleagues and one of the institutions I was visiting, when he said that whenever he went for an interview, he went in with a bag full of books, and he had written textbooks from jurisprudence, human rights, biodiversity, biotechnology, intellectual property rights. And he also told me how to get these publications out. And it is all about knowing some publishing houses that, with whom you had links. And it was, quite terrifying for me to think that this is what I was getting into. But at the same time, I think it's good that these questions have come up and we are publicly debating them. And thanks, Rehan, for sharing your thoughts. And I'm sure in the breakout sessions, we can speak more about it. Now I invite Dr. Arghya Sengupta to come and share his thoughts on research and writing.
Thanks very much, Preetham, for inviting me. I've been promising Raj to come for a while, and I'm glad that I'm finally here, and hopefully this will be the first of many occasions that I do get a chance to come here, especially because most of the people sitting here are people I know for a very long time. So thanks again for inviting me. I think since the trend of the morning has been relating personal anecdotes, I think I'll continue the trend in talking to you a little bit about the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, which I co-founded, and why we set up an organization that's dedicated to research that's outside a traditional university setting, and perhaps share some thoughts from a different perspective as to what impact in academic research might mean, or what some ideas of impact in academic research might connote. Some caveats to begin with. I'm not a full-time academic, so this talk will not be replete with any pearls of wisdom, but just practical experiences in the last year and a half that we've had at the Vidhi Center working with the Government of India. But I'd like to pick up from a point that Professor Sudarshan made, which is that the job of a judge is perhaps to adjudicate in black and white, whereas policymakers work with the greys. And I remember a speech given by Gus O'Donnell, who was a long-serving cabinet secretary to the British government. In fact, he served Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and David Cameron for a while. And he was a lawyer by training, and in a speech in Oxford, he said that when the Prime Minister asked him, and I think it was Blair at the time, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Cabinet Secretary, can you please tell me what the answer to this is? And he said, Mr. Prime Minister, my job is not to tell you the answer in black and white. My job is to tell you how to make the grey sexy. And I think as lawyers in academic who want to do research in policy and have an impact in policy, we have a similar kind of problem, because our training as lawyers is essentially to come up with answers in black and white. Whereas with policy, and most certainly policy making in India, which is largely, and so this is a bit of a generalization, as in personality driven rather than evidence driven, we find that the issue often becomes as to how you translate that legal training into a setting where you're not really, well, you're certainly not looking at a right answer, but often the ways in which you're looking for an answer are perhaps not the reasons as to how one would go about looking for that answer. So I think this would be a good takeoff point to understand what impact in academic research might mean. And I'm looking at it solely from the point of view as far as impacting governance is concerned. So I'll tell you a little bit about how we started doing what we're doing. It was 2010, and at that time there was, you might remember, there was a lot of brouhaha about the nuclear liability bill. And that time India had to sign a legislation. There was a lot of pressure from the US so that we signed this, bring in this legislation to comply with the international law on nuclear liability. At the same time, it was 25 years of Bhopal. And so there was a lot of pressure on the government not to do anything which would sort of sign away our sovereignty as far as damages is concerned. The key question as far as this legislation is how do we design a liability law that balances the interests of victims, who obviously must be compensated in the event of a nuclear accident, without, however, ensuring that we don't have a law that is so draconian that no nuclear operator or supplier would want to come to India. The policy decision that we wanted nuclear energy was a decision that was already taken, and with great humility, I don't think lawyers have a big part to play in that policy decision. Once that decision is taken, the question is how do we have an effective implementable legislation? And at that time, we were sitting in Oxford. Shiv, who's here, was doing his DPhil as well. Shiv and I, along with a couple of other friends, decided that rather than talk about it, which is what we as law students have done for a very long time, and certainly we did in law school, we might as well write to the Parliamentary Standing Committee, which is hearing this issue. And so we sent in what we thought would be a very short piece, which turned out to be a rather exhaustively researched 50-odd page document on changes that the nuclear liability law should have. And we were pleasantly surprised that we got an invitation from the Standing Committee to come and depose before them. And we did that, and that was an eye-opening experience, because the traditional middle class view of politicians is that they're up to no good and they don't understand most of the time what they're doing unless it's for their own constituents. But as far as the standing committee was concerned, as in our interactions were fantastic, as in their interventions were on the point. They were certainly not technically proficient because you don't expect them to be, but they certainly wanted to have a workable legislation and largely gave us the impression that their hearts were in the right place. And so one thing led to another, and so we deposed before them. And then about 3 days after the deposition, we got a call from the Department of Atomic Energy saying that, oh, we had a few sections that we needed some help in drafting. Would you be able to draft these sections? So we were like, sure, as in we could certainly try. And he said, yes, except that you have to do it in the next 2 hours. So I was like, okay, as in this is certainly something that was unexpected. But it would be done anyway in the next 2 hours, so I thought I might as well contribute what little I can to that particular process. And so we sent them a draft in the next 2 hours on 3 or 4 sections. And today 2 of those sections that we drafted have become the law. Now, as sort of graduate students sitting somewhere in a university in the world, this was fantastic, as in this was as much impact that we could hope for, that the research that we did for 1 month becomes the law of the land. But as a citizen of the country, it was a bit of a scary proposition, that there were 4 random guys sitting somewhere who decided to do some research over some drinks at the pub in Cowley, and then the next thing you know, they've been invited to draft the law, and the next thing you know, it's become the law. So it seemed to suggest to be that there was a gulf in the system somewhere. And so we decided to pursue this idea further. And we felt that there was a particular gap in the system, and the gap was between the stage at which policy is formulated and that policy needs to be translated into law. Now this is as in certainly in an Indian context, is a big gap, because till the stage of policy making, you have people who come in who are domain experts who suggest as to what the government should do in a particular area. But for one reason or the other, in the nuclear liability case, it was international compliance with international law or international pressure, depending on how charitable you want to be to the government. In the case of food security, it may be as in both a question of sort of demonstrating and scoring particular brownie points, whatever the justifications may be. But the fact is that there's a gap between the time policy gets formulated and that policy is implemented in law. And you hear this refrain constantly in India, and even when I was coming here, the taxi driver here said that कानून तो बहुत है पर कोई implement नहीं होता. So this is something that you hear all the time, and I've heard it all the time, that you just have a lot of laws but you don't implement it. And part of the reason is because of the fact that the laws, the way in which the laws are written, are just plainly not implementable. So there's absolutely no point in having a law which you know is not going to work in the ground, because you haven't done the empirical work to understand as to whether something will work or not work. And we felt that as an organization, it's that translational research between policy and law that a group of lawyers with some domain expertise in a few areas could perhaps add. Now, in the course of the process, I think there have obviously been many stumbling blocks, but the biggest question that arises in my mind, because as Preetham said right in the beginning, as in my previous avatar, I was a PhD student and then a lecturer in administrative law. So from a very academic background coming into this, there were several hiccups, as you might well imagine. And so I'll point out 2 or 3. And the key question that arose in my mind is, should impact in governance be a goal for academic research? I think that's the fundamental question. And I think the reason that these questions arise is, as far as working with government or in the field of governance as being lawyers, I think there is a case of, as you said, your training comes up against the particular rigors of the field of policy making and what they require. And I think that's one question that needs to be considered closely. The second related question is, how do we define impact? And I think this is what Rehan was talking about. I don't have an answer as well. But perhaps what we felt is that it's useful to think of impact rather than having as a sort of spectrum. So you can obviously have very immediate impact in terms of changing the law, like perhaps this nuclear liability example. Or perhaps you could have long-term impact in terms of shaping the public discourse. So, for example, so recently we were working on the National Judicial Appointments case, and one of the most frequently cited reports was the 14th report of the Law Commission of India, which was Motilal Setalvad's report on judicial appointments and what it said as far as appointments to High Court judges is concerned and what's going wrong. So while none of the recommendations made by the 14th Law Commission were accepted and none of them are law, the fact is that they've shaped public discourse to such a great extent that even half a century later, this is a matter that, as in this is the centerpiece of the Supreme Court's attention. So there is obviously a long-term way of seeing as to how impact, as in how we can define impact. And so I think what we try to do at Vidhi is essentially a hybrid of the two. We're essentially lawyers who try and engage with the government in order to actively bridge this gap between policy and law. And I think thinking about it, I think there's an analogy that can be drawn here, because in the 20th century, as in the field of pure science, as in there was an independent discipline of translational research which grew. Now, translational research essentially is sort of applied sciences, as in the question that as a researcher you're posing is a question that emanates from ground up, rather than a question that emanates in your head. So we felt and it was pioneered by the National Institute of Health, and now you have a full-fledged discipline which is looking at translating pure scientific results into outcomes that are measurable and discernible on the ground. I think that law, being a social science, as in partly obfuscates this sort of need for this bridge, because we feel that since law is a social science, it's meant as an instrument to respond to society's problems. Quite obviously, as in law will be responding to that. But the fact is that I think there is great scope of trying to deconstruct that a little further, to try and understand as to where that initial questioning comes from. Because again, speaking from personal experience, as in there was this moment during my PhD was on independence and accountability of the Indian higher judiciary. And I set out I was very clear in my head that I wanted to do a PhD which would suggest very clear reforms as far as judicial appointments, transfers, impeachment, post-retirement employment of judges, and it would end with a clear reform proposal. It was all very clear in my head. Now, right in the middle of when I was reading and sort of thinking about putting stuff down, as in I discovered the Federalist Papers, and the Federalist Papers is, to my mind, is one of the most fascinating pieces of political theory and constitutional theory in terms of separation of powers and checks and balances, notwithstanding the other areas that it spoke of. And I found this absolutely fascinating. And so for a period, my research interests during the middle of my PhD shifted and said, why don't I do an analysis of separation of powers in the Indian Constitution? And so this is a dilemma that we all face as legal researchers, because there's one pull towards sort of what broadly can be called pure research, in terms of the fact that your aim is the pursuit of knowledge and trying an understanding as to how something works. And the other is actively responding to a social problem. And I think as researchers, and certainly as researchers in India, I think it would be a shame if we didn't do both. Of course, this is a personal choice that everyone makes, and everyone is entitled to make that choice. But I find that and there are many people in the room who have worked with government far more than I have, but in my limited experience, the fact is that as far as legal inputs to the government of India and to state governments is concerned, as in the present level of expertise is so low that any contribution that you make, and I can guarantee you this, that anyone sitting in this room, in their subject area, any contribution you make will be possibly better than the status quo. And so the fact is that as far as researching based on questions that arise from ground up are concerned, I think there's a great opportunity. Now the question that arises is how we actually spend our time, because there are pressures, quality versus quantity, the constant need to publish, and so on. But as Rehan's example with regard to the blog post versus the law review article pointed out, and again the publication with CPA versus again the publication in a prestigious law review, as you write for different people, you write for different audiences. And the fact is that sometimes the work that you do, as in more actively with the government, may not bring immediate benefits in terms of a publication, but certainly as in there will be contribution to something that you think will serve a useful societal goal. So for example, so our organization is now working on a draft with the Ministry of Finance on drafting a law which criminalizes Ponzi schemes. And this is come out of the entire Sharada chit fund issue in Bengal, and this is an issue that's sort of quite pervasive, though not to that extent as the Sharada example pointed out. And the fact is that working on this is not just something that has a clear societal objective, as in you're talking about millions and millions of people who have invested very small amounts of money, which they, in the hope of a promised return, which is never going to come, and they're going to lose the money that they have given them. So there's a clear social goal that you're trying to deter people who are setting up these fraudulent schemes from setting them up. But at the same time, it's a fairly intellectually challenging exercise, because the fact is that laws, it's a really complicated area, because at the end of the day, you're trying to regulate certain kinds of deposit-taking activities. Now, deposit-taking activities in a society are obviously legal, so it's really quite a challenge, and a very interesting one at that, as to how you define a deposit-taking activity in a manner that legitimate deposits are acceptable and continue and are not affected in any shape or form, but at the same time, unregulated deposits of the nature that you want to criminalize are criminalized. So the fact is that there is, it is intellectually challenging, but it does have a couple of very clear drawbacks. As in, the first is time. And as a researcher, I feel that the biggest drawback with trying to work with government is the fact that you're not the master of your own time. Now, sometimes as researchers, I know it's great, because you know, if you give me a deadline of a year for a publication, you know that as in my email to you will come on the 366th day, say, and with an apology for the delay of a day. But the fact is, so sometimes it's great that you have a deadline that's set, but the fact is you just don't have enough time, and you have to produce something which in pure academic terms will be considered suboptimal. So that's a constant tension that I have all the time, because the work that we do will not be the same level as a peer-reviewed law article. But the fact is that it is something which is driven by a different demand. The second is, of course, the audience. Now, as far as working with government is concerned, as in it again, as I said, it's very personality driven, and so it depends entirely on the individual that you're dealing with. But the fact is that the key point that I want to make is the fact that the audience is not a legal one, and on balance, I think that's a great thing, because it's only when we speak to people outside the law, which I didn't do earlier, but now I do fairly regularly, you realize that as lawyers, and I'm assuming that most people in the room are lawyers, as in how obscure and difficult our language is, and I'm sure that it's something that realization just doesn't dawn on us, because as in words like prima facie and locus standi are part of our everyday lingo, and we won't bat an eyelid before saying it. But the fact is that that's not how, as I've been told, normal people speak. And so I think there are challenges, and so it's translational in many, many different ways. So what we try to do is something which is akin to Google's 80-20 rule, which is that as 80% of the time, as in we do work that the center has from the government and so on, and the remaining 20% of the time we do what we want, because if we feel that that's the best way to try and get creative ideas and to ensure that that the work that we do is not entirely driven by what is needed, but also driven by what we feel are ideas that are good and necessary. So I think as far as impact in academic research is concerned, as lawyers, I think that it's important for us to carefully understand as to what the motivations for our research are. And part of what I think is important is that part of this motivation should be ground up. And as far as working with government is concerned, I think there's a great opportunity, and I think if more and more people from universities were involved in this, I think most certainly, and I'm assuming that the quality will of course be great, I'm sure the country will be better off for it. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Argo, for sharing those experiences. Very insightful, for many of us to know how research, feeds into work in the government. Now, I was just reminded of when I was a lawyer in the Supreme Court that while waiting for the long hours, for my case to come up, there was a game that I would play with a friend of mine. We would both sit and we would think that, who has dyed their hair black and who's wearing a wig. And it turned out that the candidates in the court were really, there were quite a number of them who turned out to be either doing one of the two. And I was surprised with this black, gray, white business today that even though, a lot of lawyers put in an effort to dye their hair or to wear a wig, which it would be jet black, it was all done to hide the shades of gray with which they work in everyday life. So I was, I'm quite intrigued by this, that I think as much as Ronald Dworkin talks about, that this is the right thing to do about abortion, it is always the case of the gray in the law, which is about interpretation, that lawyers feed off. And that's very interesting, I think, as researchers, we know that there needs to be an end product, which is an argument, but it cannot but feed off this, from this area of gray, which we, want to interpret. And so the policy law, black and white, gray distinction is something that we need to think about in a much deeper way to see that what are the, and I think Argo did a very, you really, your talk was so insightful in terms of how you manage the end product, which is the black or the white, while being trained in the gray for such a long period of time. And so thank you so much for all your insightful comments, and thankfully today we are not running short of time, and so there is time for Q&A, so any questions? So Professor Eriksson. And the mics are that you just have to switch it on by pushing it up, so that's how it works.
Usually presented to us, and even within the bench. And of course, we have a bench of 21 judges, so you could have 6 people on one black, 6 people on white. Maybe the merger would be the great. But my question, before we anecdote, I ventured into the blog business with this idea, as you mentioned, we have slightly more impact than one does in the usual blog articles or books. And so I was asking yourself, and follow the guidelines, and obviously be more peppy than what people would be in the other media. But then I got it back, and they had inserted 2 inaccurate, irrelevant, and misleading graphs into my article. So that's, of course, that would never happen to me in a learned journal or in a book which I had controlled. What does one do about this? I guess the anecdote ended well in the sense that because it's that type of media, you can have it again. And at least for the future, it won't be there anymore, which is not the case in the other media. Even though maybe the damage will already have been done by the thousands and millions of people that have read it in the 4 days before I discovered this. What do you do about this?
And serious articles and blog posts are concerned, as we're still very much, as this is a trend that is in its infancy still, as in the wider scheme of things. And I think there's always a difficulty in terms of accuracy and so on, and obviously it's not the same level as a peer-reviewed journal is. But I think there are two quick thoughts that I have on the issue. One is a thought that we've done to different strokes for different folks, essentially. And the second point is as far as this question of accuracy is concerned, and I think it would be, I guess that we can't really paint all blogs with the same brush. I mean, there are of course many different kinds of blogs. There are better blogs. There are blogs which do more serious research than many sort of law reviews in India. So there's a blog on Indian constitutional law and philosophy, which is run by Gautam Bhatia, which I think has some fantastic articles, better than many law review journals in India. So I think it would be useful to keep in mind that, of course, there are blogs where as an accuracy and so on become a problem, but there are ones which are as in where it's not as much.
I fully agree with everything that Arun said. I think the only thing I would add is one thing personally that I always insist on is seeing the final copy before it's published. Now, they don't always do that, but I think it's worth asking. And for the most part, whoever it's been, whether it's been a journal or a book chapter or a blog post, they've been open to that. And if nothing else, you can catch some last-minute typos or something. But so it's even worth it at that level. But at least you will catch, these big changes or mistakes.
I have a question for you. Once you are licensed as a lawyer, you don't have to worry about your teaching or practicing. You can take part in public debate, you can litigate and teach. But in India, we have these walls that are created. So for example, tomorrow if one of us is interested in a topic or an issue, yesterday someone was here talking about the death penalty. How do you then navigate, how do you then write about it, but then also litigate it and then have an impact in that way? That was one. The second question I had was, you talked about, Mrs. Singh Gupta, about your audience being a non-legal one. And I was wondering what interaction and feedback you received from the legal fraternity, in the sense that, do people get back to you on the work that is published? Because again, my sense is of one of Walls that those in the legal profession, say in litigation, they look upon this kind of legal research work that is done in the public policy space as something different from what the law that they're doing, and they don't see it as law per se, they see it as something different. And so I'm wondering if you've had interactions or feedback about the work that you've done, and do lawyers incorporate into what they're doing, or do they come and do part-time work with you, things like that? So thank you.
It's a great question. I don't really know the answer to that because I never practiced law in India, but my sense is that even in the US, academia has become, and maybe legal academia is a little bit of an exception, but not really, has become more and more specialized and is more and more separate from the actual governments in the country. And I actually think that to the extent that law professors do contribute, it's usually when they're taking a break from academia. So they'll be appointed as a cabinet member, right? So like Elena Kagan taught with Barack Obama. She's now in the Supreme Court. Cass Sunstein was Barack Obama's best buddy. He was made the head of OIRA. So I think it's more on that level, and I think similar things happen here. I'm not positive, but my sense is based on who's in power, different sorts of academics are empowered to head different agencies or different organizations. And I genuinely think that's when academics have the most impact. You may be right that legal academics have a little bit more of a voice in the US, but my sense is that the vast majority of legal academics are like most other academics, and having a fairly circumscribed conversation with themselves.
Yeah, just follow up. I think that in India, as you're absolutely right, in the sense that there are these very distinct silos and litigators that want academics and it's very unfortunate that that's really the case. But given that we have to work with this, what we've tried to do is sort of it's simple as now we come out with a report, we hold a convening, as where we have lawyers, we have civil society activists, we have government folks, retired government folks, anyone else who is interested and wants to turn up. And we have a good discussion with people coming in with different perspectives. And I think it's very useful for us also to get that feedback. And I personally value the feedback from non-lawyers more than from lawyers from experience in the last year and a half. Because the fact is, and by lawyers here, I should qualify that I mean litigating lawyers, because we've been discussing this sort of whole issue. Because the fact is, I feel that there is greater engagement with what we've written with other academics and sort of people who are interested in the domain than with litigators, and that's been my personal experience. So as far as using it in work is concerned, as in I'm not a litigator, but I did, as I was just mentioning, I did spend the last 2.5 months in the Supreme Court on this National Judicial Appointments Commission case, and I was absolutely amazed by the style that litigators have and their attitude towards research. And sort of this may be a crass oversimplification, but the attitude towards research is primarily finding that right paragraph in the right judgment, irrespective of what context it is in, and just picking those and reading those lines out to the court. That really clinches the issue. And most of the time it's without much understanding of the context or the larger issues. And so I was pretty amazed as to the attitude towards research. And so as far as engagement is concerned, I think there's good engagement in terms of discussing things with lawyers and non-lawyers, but as far as actual filtering through into the legal/judicial process is concerned, as an advocate most.
Large part of what I do involves trying to understand the quantitative effects of policy A versus policy B, for example. And that at some level or probably always requires some kind of statistical procedure or using a mathematical technique. That gives a lot of discipline in trying to understand something. Now, do you have an alternative? Because at best, if my job is to try and understand or provide a robust quantitative estimate to something, there might be an issue with one technique versus another technique. But then if you think this is not the right thing to do you have an alternative?
Thank you. That's a good question. I'm glad you asked it because it helps me to clarify. I've had great teachers in economics, A.L. Nagar and K. Krishna. And so I have a great sense of appreciation of what economics can do. Unfortunately, I find that a lot of people simply think that running a regression and producing some numbers is some sign of intellectual manhood and get away with it. So the point about this, and this is where I think some training in law would be good for economists, is that you need to cultivate a judgment about when to use something and when not. I mean, you may be able to fairly accurately predict the number of road fatalities in Delhi in the year 2015 based on what we know before. You cannot predict where the fatality will occur or whether it will be a man, woman, or child who will die. All that you can't do, but you can pretty closely come to the number of people who will die on Delhi roads. Now that's thanks to what the discipline of statistics, the law of large numbers, and a certain kind of rigor and a form of distribution that occurs will help you do all that. So my plea simply is that a lot of the time economists get away with spurious stuff. So I am pleading for a certain training in the art of practical judgment that the discipline of law indicates, which is essential, and also for a certain respect for what you can do. But you need to be modest because you cannot, predict everything just because you have statistics and quantitative techniques. To know when to use them and when they might be misleading is about the best we can hope for. For the most part, a number of difficult questions in society are not amenable to just a sort of a quantitative prediction as to what would happen because you're dealing with self-interpreting agents. I just wanted to add though to the other point. My interest in law continued in the sense that I was intrigued as to why a PhD thesis in Oxford, Granville Austin's Cornerstone of a Nation, should get cited. I mean, I'd read 17 volumes of Shiva Rao, which is much more thorough, but I find when I was looking at economic legislation and Supreme Court decisions, quotations from Granville Austin, and I didn't know who this man was, and so on. But it just goes to show that if you write something and put it out there, you never know who picks it up and what impact it will have. Dieter Conrad wrote an article. He was invited by Madras University, by Professor Ramarao at Madras University, and he had a journal which I think is discontinued, called the Indian Journal of International Law, in which Conrad wrote an essay about implied limitations on the power of amendment. Conrad was thinking of the Weimar Republic and what happened in Germany and why the basic law in Germany is the way it is. And he thought, well, with Subbarao's Golaknath case being in discussion at that time, he will write this article, right? Now it's in an obscure journal, you will not be able to, easily lay your hands on it and so on. But, Goga Subbarao, of course, was interested and read it. And then comes along Palgiwala in the Supreme Court, quoting from this article by Dieter Conrad, saying, is it possible that by an amendment of the Constitution of India, you will change the Republic of India into a monarchy? Would that be a valid amendment? Does that not imply that there is something essential, unamendable about the nature of the Constitution? So you see, this is an argument that Dieter Conrad, he didn't intend to influence the court and influence the Yeshwananda Bharati case, but it did. And so I think you never know. I think it's a good idea to do some thinking about issues that he wrote the article because Golaknath was being discussed. I think therefore a certain connection to current concerns and honest work is all that we can aspire to do.
We have time for a couple of more questions or comments.
Question is really directed towards the mode of publication. We do know that the practice is the standard form of law reviews or policy journals or even reports for that matter that requires a fair bit of analysis therein. And we're looking to reach the section that reads and comments and reflects back. But then again, coming back to accessibility or discussions in the other model, which is open access public publishing as such, how would you say, would you want young scholars to be encouraged enough to actually go towards that set of publishing in an ideological subscription more than the proprietary one? Because of course, law reviews at times also, or even publishers, they do pay handsomely at times, but that comes, probably in the day. But when you want to reach an audience and receive in response, you can take an open access model far more encouraging manner. So any comments from the panel, because I didn't hear this particular point being discussed at all.
At least, right? And that you retain the copyright. And I think they can be shared more widely than Lexis and Westlaw. You're the IT lawyer, not me, so actually, we can talk about this further. But I think the Creative Commons type of publication agreement is becoming increasingly widespread, at least in the US. So that's a start. My sense is that this becomes more of a problem when you go for peer-reviewed journals, because you usually have to submit only to them, and then they almost always insist on taking your copyright. So that's a much more difficult question. I just revert back to my sort of first anecdote, where I think the key is publishing different forms of a similar idea rather than publishing a full-length piece in an open access journal. I'm not convinced. I don't mean this to be an elitist point. I just think that people have things to do, and one of those things is not to read law review articles. I don't think most people have the time or the interest to read a full law review article anyway. I think they might have the time to read a blog post or a newspaper article. So if you can write one of those and then also turn it into a law review article, right? that's, I guess, all I have to say about
Right,
that.
so just to add a bit on that, because this comes from a particular discussion from a fellow scholar who
Definitely starts at 12 o'clock, Professor Ramchandra Guha will, deliver a seminar. But let me thank our distinguished speakers today for sharing their experiences and also for reflecting on them. And I'm quite pleased with the two plenary sessions today and yesterday, because many of these things tied up. In the first session, Professor Bakshi had said that, he quoted Descartes and Camus and said that one said that I think therefore I am, and the other said that I rebel and therefore I am. And today's sessions, I think, focus quite a bit on how we think and which might spur us to rebel and speak truth to power. And hopefully in the breakout sessions, we'll be able to reflect more upon about the different ways in which we write, why we decide to research on particular issues, what spurs us and asks us to have a particular research agenda. And I think that we have had a very good set of insights and experience sharing in this session, which should be food for thought in the next sessions. Thank you so much, our speakers today, and I invite you all to share a cup of tea with us. On the left, as soon as you get out of this room, on the left there, and we reassemble at 12 o'clock for the seminar by Professor Ramchandra Guha. Thank you very much.